Can I have your attention, please? I know it's a phenomenal meal, and the views are million-dollar views, but we want to get started. We have I would say, a priceless program for you. So if you can just keep any conversations to a hush for just a minute and grab the food close. Turn your chair if you need to. It's a fantastic program. I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Sam Lewis, who many of you know, and he is going to guide us through this. Sam, please.
Sorry to interrupt the lunch, but we had a change in program. Those of you who were here this morning heard Ed Dirigian say that because Secretary Clinton's mother died, she was unable to go to the big meeting on Afghanistan in Istanbul. So her deputy, Bill Burns, suddenly who was supposed to be your speaker today at lunch, Bill went to Istanbul in place of the secretary. But the management has figured out a way to keep you all amused anyway during lunch. They hoped. And they asked me to moderate this rather unruly group of three here. What they're going to do is kind of lower the level of seriousness and raise the level of anecdotal material from the morning sessions briefly. And so this panel is going for a few minutes to exchange some stories about how Madrid came about and what really happened there that you won't always find in the history books and the memoirs. All of them were active participants at Madrid. I was back here in Washington directing this institute actually at the time of Madrid, so I saw it from afar. But they all have so many stories about how things really happened. We won't have time to fit them all in, but I've asked them to try to get some of the juicier ones out. And some of them may actually reflect some of their opinions about the role of our chief negotiator, who spoke to us very eloquently and effectively this morning. We have two ambassadors and one phenomenal, unique person on this panel. The ambassadors are Dan Kurtzer, Aaron Miller, and the unique individual is Gamal Hilal, who was the translator for the Secretaries of State since George Washington's time, I think. And he's been in all the meetings and knows where all the bodies are buried, and they're all in his notes somewhere. And he's agreed to come out of the shadows and give a few anecdotes from his perspective. We're going to start off by Dan Kurtzer is going to talk a bit, give us a few insights into how the run-up to Madrid, the road to Madrid, looked to some of the travelers. Dan, it's all yours.
You've heard this morning, and we'll hear this afternoon, a great deal about the substance and the process. I want to talk to you about the backroom logistics. On October 18th, 1991, Secretary Baker and Soviet Foreign Minister Pankin announced the Madrid Peace Conference, but it wasn't until that Sunday that we actually secured the final agreement from the Spanish government. And to my surprise, I was dropped off in Madrid with three other people to actually set up the conference. We spent the next 9 days in rather extraordinary frenzy trying to put this thing together. And the first question that the four of us asked Secretary Baker is, how are we to negotiate all of the details that go into a conference? You remember in 1973 when the United States was trying to put together the Geneva Peace Conference, there was a debate over the shape of the table and who would enter the conference room first, who would speak, how long would they speak for. And Secretary Baker's instructions to us were very simple. He said, just make it happen. His phone was open for the next 9 days, and we, in fact, set up a conference in which there was no negotiation over all of these issues. In fact, the Secretary instructed us at one point when we had gotten his approval for the shape of the table and the order of speaking and the amount of time allocated for speeches. He even suggested to us that when we convene the delegations, we dress casually. And so in one of the most important procedural run-up meetings, the Madrid Peace Conference, I wore jeans and a sweater in a room full of diplomats attired as diplomats normally are. One of the problems we faced as soon as we got to Madrid was in the hall that had been assigned to us, one of Spain's most noted museum-like national buildings. We walked in and saw this array of phenomenal tapestries on the wall, each one probably about 40 feet high and about 15 or 20 feet across. And one of us asked our Spanish hosts, what do the tapestries represent? And with great pride, he announced it was the Christian victory over Muslims back. We suggested that it probably wouldn't work to hold a peace conference related to the Middle East. And it took a decision of the Spanish government to actually have the tapestries moved, the only time in the history of Spain that those tapestries have been moved from the room. The point of these stories, of course, is both to suggest that with the very strong leadership that the United States, President Bush and Secretary Baker were exercising at this time, it was possible to reach agreement on a set of issues that constantly bedevil other conference preparations. Many of you in this room have negotiated in a conference setting, and there are always questions and challenges with respect to the speaking order, the precedents, the length of time, rights of rebuttal, and all the rest. The United States was in such a strong position by this time that we literally could dictate those specific issues, and the parties still showed up at the end to the conference itself.
Thanks, Dan. Aaron?
Madrid was really a marriage of a region that was ready for change and a dynamism in American diplomacy that we haven't seen since. And I just want to tell two stories. Both reflect the style and the substance of the Secretary of State. Both stories are eminently tellable, and no one will be embarrassed. The first occurred 3 or 4 months into the process. It took about 6 months until Secretary Baker stopped calling me Andy. But once he learned my name, we developed a pretty close relationship. And I remember on one trip, 10 hours to Tel Aviv, we had nothing to do for at least for the first several hours. Talking points would come in the middle of the night. Those were I think before computers, I'm still using yellow legal pads to do my writing, but a fly had boarded the plane at Andrews, a large black fly. And Gamal and Dan and Dennis and I were engaged in a futile effort to capture this fly and to kill it. And Secretary Baker walked through the staff cabin on his way back to brief the press and observed the scene of three or four grown men trying to catch this one fly. Then returned to his cabin. About 5 or 6 hours into the flight, I'm now working on talking points, head down, yellow legal pad in front of me, scribbling. I sensed this presence at my back, and I turned around, and there was Secretary of State Baker. Didn't say a word, just dropped one big, dead, nasty fly on my legal pad, and didn't say a word and returned to the cabin, but there was a bubble that was over his head, and it said, "That's how we catch flies in Texas. Don't you boys try to do that now." And it was at that moment that I understood what the Israelis, the Arabs, and the Palestinians were dealing with. It required toughness and reassurance to get to Madrid. And it was the marriage of that toughness and reassurance embodied in Secretary of State that was vital in producing the conference. One additional story. There were many points in this process, and I think Amal will refer to a few, when we saw the trademark notebook that the Secretary used slam shut with a threat to either leave or, in the case of the story I'm about to tell, actually leaving. He told Shamir many times during moments of great frustration and exasperation, even though the two of them established a very close personal relationship, that it would be a long time before he'd be back unless the Prime Minister realized the opportunities that were presented here and made a decision. It worked with Shamir. It also worked with the Palestinians. And there was one very important moment shortly before the invitations were issued where we really were having a difficult time getting them to make a decision. And their situation was horrible. They were caught between a West Bank and Gaza population that really didn't believe in the process and a PLO in Tunis that sought ultimate control of it. And we were asking the Palestinians to get the answer from Arafat about attendance. We were at the consulate in East Jerusalem, and things were not going well. And there was no question that something was required to get the Palestinian delegation, the weakest link for sure, understandably, in the process, to make a decision. And at one point, the notebook slammed shut, and not only did the secretary threaten to leave, he got up and walked out, leaving Dennis, Dan, and I in the unenviable position of having to explain to the Palestinians that, in effect, if they didn't get that authorization, it might be the last time that they'd see him. And they did. And within 15 or 20 minutes, the secretary was back as if a football coach, with tremendous reassurance, in a huddle, a literal huddle, with the Palestinian delegation, reassuring them that they had made the right decision, that it wouldn't be easy, but in effect, he was proud of what they had done. And as Nabil Shah knows, even though Nabil was not there, they invested in Baker with respect to this process and in the United States. And there was a measure of trust and confidence there. So and that's what it's going to take again. So, Mr. Secretary, again, thank you. Thank you so much.
I just have so many memories and stories, but I don't think I can talk about all of them. But certainly it was a privilege to work with the Secretary Baker. I don't think it was possible to have Madrid if James Baker was not a Secretary of State. People might think that just because of the political circumstances in the region and a huge victory over the Iraqi forces and the liberation of Kuwait, all of this made all the parties ready to go to Madrid, but actually the truth is far from that. For months, he actually had to fight every hour, every week, every month in order to persuade the various leaders that this is in the best interest of their countries. In that process, there are so many stories when he got really mad, and you don't want to see him when he's really mad. But I remember once was with President Hafez al-Assad in Syria, and the secretary negotiated for weeks over certain elements of the substance related to 242 and the applicability of that on the Golan front. And he went to a meeting, we went to a meeting, and in about 5-6 minutes into the meeting, he used that famous Baker style. He slammed his book, and he said, "Mr. President, I've got nothing else to do. I've tried to help you. I have tried to help you bring the Golan Heights back to Syria, but there is nothing for me to do." And actually, at that time, I thought, great, the meeting will be over in 10 minutes, and we were just going to run to the hotel. And the Syrians obviously realized that Secretary Baker was serious, that he's going to leave, and that's it. There's no more diplomacy and no more efforts to go to convene a conference. So, and I was telling him what's happening in terms of the deliberation among the Syrians. And then, and while they are in the midst of sort of like discussing what are we going to do if he leaves, and what if this process will not really emerge, And then all of a sudden, he said to Hafez al-Assad, Mr. President, it's really too bad that I can't help you. I was really thinking about all kinds of great ideas, including bringing some American boys to the Golan Heights. And the minute he said that, he turned Hafez al-Assad on a dime. That meeting that I thought will end in about 10 minutes lasted for 8.5 hours. So that's basically Jim Baker. The next morning, when we went basically hoping that we will be able to conclude everything and prepare for the Madrid conference, then the Syrian vice president at that time, Abdul Halim Khaddam, presented an idea that basically will walk back everything. And Secretary Baker got so mad that he basically said, go to hell, go get your land. And I looked at him, I said, Mr. Secretary, do you want me to interpret this? He said, no, 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 they got it. The other episode, it seems like most of them are with the Syrians. It was in New York. And it was during the UNGA, the UN General Assembly meetings, about a month and a half before convening Madrid. And at that time, Secretary Baker sent letters of assurances to all the leaders with the invitations. And certainly these are American letters of assurances. And the Syrian delegation took that letter of assurance and they drafted their own. And Secretary Baker got a wind of this before the meeting with the Syrian foreign minister, and he decided to go to that meeting and let all hell break loose. So we went to the meeting with the Syrian foreign minister, and they sat down. Obviously, he was very gloomy, very angry, and they realized that there is something wrong. And Secretary Baker had copies of the letter of assurances in his hand, and he looked at Mr. Shara, and he said, Mr. Minister, these are my letters. And he threw them up in the air and he said, what makes you think that you can rewrite my letters? And I think at that time, the Syrian delegation realized that they made a huge mistake of even thinking that they can second guess a draft or a formal letter that was presented by Secretary Baker. I think in the region, when we traveled very frequently, we were almost there every other week between the liberation of Kuwait and the convening of the Madrid conference. In most countries, the working staff used to call him Mr. America. Whenever Secretary Baker arrived in any capital, people will know that it is serious. And I think the credibility that he had as a man and the administration had at that time, the political will and the determination and the creativity, they really helped put all of this together. In addition to one very important factor, that he is truly a master negotiator. Mr. Secretary, thank you. It was a pleasure serving you, sir. Thank you.
Two quick stories. All of us from the Northeast learned a great deal about Texas during this run-up to Madrid. On the way back from our trips to the Middle East, in the staff lounge of the airplane, we would play a game of poker. And one evening during one of our trips back, the secretary wandered back from his cabin and saw a fairly large pile of chips on the table and said, "Boys, what are you playing?" We said, "Well, nickel, dime, quarter." And he looked with astonishment and said, "Well, there must be several $100s of money on the table." And we said, "No, actually, it's nickel, dime, and quarter." So he took out a $10 bill, threw it on the table, and said, "I'm buying the pot," and walked away. We learned how you play poker in Texas after that experience. The other more serious anecdote is actually referred to. The Secretary included it in his book, The Politics of Diplomacy. And I go back to that day of October 18th, 1991. As Aaron suggested in his remarks, it was a day of serious ups and downs because until late in the morning, the meetings that the Secretary had had with both the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership were somewhat less than convincing that we had bridged all the gaps necessary to bring about a conference. And around midday, while the Secretary was in a one-on-one meeting with the Soviet foreign minister, who was also in Jerusalem at the time, we were told that he had decided that we didn't quite have it, that we weren't quite ready to call a conference, given the gaps between the parties. We asked if, members of the team asked if we could meet with the Secretary, and he was not entirely happy to be pulled out of a meeting with the Soviet foreign minister to talk to his staff, but he was also quite ready to listen to the arguments that we had mustered that suggested that even though the gaps had not been fully bridged, we were about as close as we thought we were going to get. And without an American leap of faith, the parties would probably drift away, and it would be harder in the future to try to bring them back together. It was easy for staff to make this recommendation, but very challenging for the Secretary, A, to be convinced, and B, to get on the phone with the President and say that we were committing the power and prestige of the United States to take a leap into the unknown, because in fact, when in fact the Secretary and the Soviet foreign minister called a press conference that afternoon in Jerusalem, we had not dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. It does suggest, though, a lesson, Mr. Secretary, that we've learned from you and I think can be applied even today, and that is that you never quite reach a conclusion without a political leap of faith. At the end of the day, should the United States, as we all hope, assert the leadership that's required to get this process moving again, it is highly unlikely that all those I's will be dotted and all the T's will be crossed. But I hope we can learn a lesson from this one experience, that a resolute decision by our chief negotiator and our president actually can convince the parties that that difference can be bridged. I join my colleagues, Mr. Secretary, in thanking you for the opportunity of serving with you and teaching us a great deal about diplomacy. Thank you.
It's really turning out to be and it's appropriate, a tribute to the Secretary of State. I'm not sure how else to explain it. I mean, I've been extremely annoyingly negative in my own pronouncements about this process over the last several years, but it reminds me of the persistence that is required once you're in a process that looks like it might succeed, the persistence that's required. And I tell this story as evidence of that. This was pre-Madrid, but again, it reflects a certain reality, which we're all grappling with. In June of 1990, the United States was forced to sever its really pretty empty dialogue with the PLO as a consequence of an attack by a small group which was on the PLO's executive committee. And Arafat refused to denounce the group. And I had the unfortunate task of walking the cable in that the Secretary of State had to sign. And this is after 6 to 8 months of working this issue, having been warned by just about everybody to stay away from the Arab-Israeli peace process. So I walked the cable in, authorizing our ambassador in Morocco to suspend the dialogue. And the Secretary didn't say much, looked at it, read it over very carefully, initialed it, and then, much to my shock, took the cable and threw it up in the air. And as I watched it and watched it descend, he looked at me and his eyes squinted and he said, "Aaron," he said, "in my next life, I want to be a Middle East negotiator just like you, because I know one thing, I'll be guaranteed a permanent source of employment." And the truth is, it's right. It's a problem that needs to continue to be worked and worked with realistic expectations and without illusion. And I think those two things, combined with our willingness to be tough and reassuring at the same time, and to empower a Secretary of State, to have the President empower a Secretary of State to do that kind of diplomacy, it's really the keys on our side to succeeding.
That's a tough one. A friend of mine once asked me, how would you describe Secretary Baker as a negotiator? And I said, I think the best way to describe him from my own experience is to listen carefully to the song by Kenny Rogers, The Gambler, because he really knew how to hold them and knew how to fold them. Throughout that process that led to Madrid, there was nothing that he did not think about and plan in advance. He knew where he wants to go. Maybe sometimes which road he sort of like waited on that, but he knew exactly where he wanted to go. And he was very patient. I think the shortest meeting ever with the Syrian president, I think was about 3.5 hours. That was the shortest. And the longest, I believe, I wrote this down somewhere, it was about 9.5 hours. He was willing to put the time. He was willing to listen. He was extremely patient. And maybe when he started all of this after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, as he said this morning, he did not touch the Middle East before then. He probably did not spend much time reading about the Middle East, but certainly in a matter of few weeks, he became a master of all the facts. The Middle East is all about details. And if you master the details, then people will take you seriously. And that is what he did early on. It was almost impossible to throw an argument at Jim Baker that he will not sort of like recraft it and throw it back at you. And that helped a great deal. Sometimes he will use humor, sometimes he will use toughness, sometimes he will use patience, but he will always use different tools to get to where he wants to be. I have a couple other stories, but I don't think I'm going to share them because it's just not right. And I just truly think that in a time like now, not only that region, but many parts of the world really would love to have another Jim Baker. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, that just lifts a little bit of the curtain, and there are a million more stories. Their books are all being published, or have been published, or will be published, so you can all read the rest of the stories in the books. I was instructed in moderating, allegedly, this panel, that you also had to have time to eat and chat a little more before you had to go back to work. But before you do that, the Honorable Richard Solomon, president of this here place, has a word for you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't want to keep you. I know you're frying. We've been in this building about 8 months, and so we're still learning how to use it. Moshe Safdie, the architect, did a really brilliant job, except in designing an open, transparent building, which was, he felt that transparency was a good symbolic expression of peacemaking efforts. He created these wonderful curtain walls, but in the wintertime, as the sun gets lower, it's imposing on you all what you're now feeling. So we're going to be installing drop screens so you won't fry the next time you come here. I do just want to say two quick things. One, we're really indebted to Ed Jerigian, his crew, Matt Chen, for the help they gave us in putting this together, this event, and for our part, Paul Hughes, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, and Lena Andrews, Britt Manzo, Scott Lazinski, Neil Kritz, Allison Sturma, Kim Feinstein, and Lisa Fraser all helped out. Again, we're getting a sense of how to use this facility, but we're indebted to you for being more than guinea pigs for what is obviously a very interesting and important day. My final point, one of the congressionally chartered responsibilities of the Institute of Peace is public outreach, public education. We run programs with the high schools every year, a peace essay contest. Here on the edge of the mall, of course, we're going to attract a lot of visitors to the war memorials. We think of this location as the War and Peace corner of the mall. Underneath your feet is 20,000 square feet of exhibit space, and one of the next phase of the development of the Institute is to develop exhibits for all those high school kids and the tourists that describe the challenges of managing conflict in today's world. We're still raising resources for that, but we do have a phase one set of exhibits that you're invited in the next half hour before our afternoon panels begin. You'll see right behind these, this colonnade series of television screens. They are what we call our Witnesses to Peace exhibits, and they tell the story in 3, 4, 5 minutes of notable peacemakers. There's one of George Mitchell, for example, who describes the challenge of creating the Good Friday Agreement. Our favorite is a dog. The dog is a mine-sniffing dog, and the discussion in this 3 or 4 minutes is how after a conflict you need to clear the fields of mines so that the farmers can get back to work, and there are 3 or 4 other witnesses. The other thing right behind these screens is what we call our Peace Well. There are a series of projection images of the challenges, again, of trying to deal with conflict and the objectives of the Institute of Peace. So over the next half hour, as you take a break from the lunch and prepare for the afternoon panels, we invite you, Anna Louise Colgan, who runs our public education space, and some of her colleagues are behind here to explain the exhibits to you. In any event, we're really indebted to you all for coming. I hope you're not too fried, and the one thing we probably forgot to advise you is to bring sunglasses. We'll do better next time. Thank you very much.